So earlier this week, I did an unboxing of the Samsung Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra and I gave you some of my first impressions. My biggest question was, how will it stack up against the M1 iPad Pro? And now that I've had some time to test both devices against each other, let's see how they both did. Let's ramble.
Hold up, place go wild when I pull up. They all on me like they want some.
Hey, what is up guys? It is great to see you all again. And if you're new here, I'm Patrick and this is where I ramble about tech and other stuff. All right, so before we get into this, I want to clarify a few things. Yes, I'm an Apple user. I use an iPhone 13 Pro, a 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max chip. I love my iPad mini 6, and of course my M1 iPad Pro, which is the iPad we will be pitting against the Samsung today. Heck, I even wear an Apple Watch, but would I consider myself an Apple fanboy? Absolutely not. I come from many years of Android usage. I will use whatever works best for me at a given time. I'm a lover of tech, not a lover of brands. And if you want to know why I ended up switching everything to Apple, I gave you the whole backstory in my previous unboxing video. So if you're interested in that, I'll link to that video at the end of this one. Anyway, I can confidently say that I went into this test without much bias and fully open to accepting whatever outcome I would find. Now, with that said, let's dive in. We're gonna have a look at the design, the speakers, let's talk about this notch, the cameras, we'll test the processing power, compare the displays, of course we're gonna take a look at the S Pen and the Apple Pencil, check out the keyboard cases on both devices, we'll talk about apps, battery life, price, and of course we'll try to come to a clear conclusion of which is the better tablet, or rather which one is better for you. So starting off with the design, there are some obvious differences, and the first thing I noticed is how thin this Samsung tablet really is. It's hard to imagine all of that tech crammed into that super flat body. It is also significantly taller than the iPad Pro, and because it is so thin and so tall, it appears to be very light, but it is in fact a little bit heavier than the M1 iPad Pro. The iPad Pro is a little bit wider, but the Samsung is a lot taller. The dimensions of the iPad Pro are similar to an A4 sheet of paper, which makes it feel quite natural to read documents in portrait mode. Whereas the dimensions of the Samsung make it feel a little awkward to use it in portrait orientation, and it does feel much more like it was meant to be used in landscape mode. And we'll talk much more about that later on in the video. Another thing I noticed straight away is that the bezels on the Samsung are much thinner, and that does look very sleek, but it also means there's less room to place your hands and your thumbs, and it's more prone to accidental taps. And that indicates to me that this tablet might be geared more towards desktop use rather than using it primarily as a handheld tablet. Looking at the sides of each tablet, both tablets have a power button, volume rockers, they both have 4 speakers, which we will test in a minute, but the iPad has 5 microphones and the Samsung has 3. They both have a tray, although the one on the M1 iPad Pro is for a SIM card, and the one on the Ultra, since mine is Wi-Fi only, is for a micro SD card. And that is one of the advantages of this tablet because it actually lets you expand the internal storage. Now, of course, micro SD card speeds are nothing compared to the speed of the internal SSD, which means this expandable storage is meant for documents and files and not for things like apps. Nevertheless, it's a nice option to have and one that Apple certainly doesn't offer because they just love selling us their very expensive internal storage. Both tablets have a USB-C port, although the Samsung port is a USB-C 3.2, whereas the iPad Pro is rocking a Thunderbolt port, which allows for much faster transfer speeds. Now, this probably won't matter a great deal to most people, but for things like photo and video editing, the faster transfer speeds on the iPad Pro are certainly a welcome feature. Right, so there's been a lot of debate on the internet about which tablet has the better speakers. In my opinion, there is a clear winner, but why don't we listen to both tablets for a bit so you can make up your own mind before I give you my opinion.
Hold up, place go wild when I pull up. They all on me like they want some. Think I got what you need, well I have none. Hop off, you're a freak and I'm handsome. Slide up in the crowd like 2 chains. This snake is on top of the full chain. Sign out with the star, no new name.
So what do you think? Which one sounds better? Let me know in the comments. To me personally, the iPad sounds much better, but I guess it's a matter of taste and preference. But let's be honest, they both sound pretty great. We'll talk about the mics on both tablets when we test the cameras in just a little bit, but first let's talk about this notch. Yeah, the Samsung has a notch. And if you remember the commercials where Samsung ridiculed Apple for having a notch, you understand why this is funny. Anyway, I just told you I'm an Apple user, my iPhone has a notch, and now even my MacBook Pro has a notch, so I would be a little bit of a hypocrite if I were to act like this notch bothers me, and to be quite honest with you, it doesn't. After a few minutes, I don't even notice it's there. And of course, the notch has a purpose because it houses not one, but two cameras, and it supports Face Unlock. Now, Face Unlock, in my experience, has been very much hit or miss. Enough to make it annoying to use, so I actually prefer the fingerprint scanner on the Samsung, which works without fail. Face ID on the M1 iPad Pro, however, works just fine. Having said that, the dual cameras and the notch are a nice thing to have, and in my opinion, the front-facing camera looks a little bit better. And even though the iPad has more mics, I actually think the Samsung sounds a little bit better. The image seems crisper to me, and the audio just sounds a little bit fuller. Let me know in the comments if you agree. Now, does that mean the Samsung is better for video calls? Well, we know that Apple introduced Center Stage, where the camera keeps you center at all times, and because it is cropped in, it can emulate pan and tilt motions. The Samsung has something similar, but it's not as smooth. Still, I much prefer doing video calls on the Samsung for one main reason, and that is the position of the camera. Samsung seems to understand how most of us use our tablets when we do video calls, whereas Apple, for some reason, stubbornly keeps placing the camera on the top of the iPad, which means when you're using it in landscape mode, you get this weird side angle, even with Center Stage, which makes it look like you're looking off to the side, and I find that quite disengaging. I really hope Apple changes that in the near future. Now let's talk about these rear cameras for a bit. The iPad Pro has an f1.8 12 megapixel wide and an f2.4 10 megapixel ultra wide camera plus a LiDAR scanner. The Samsung has an f2.0 13 megapixel wide camera, but only a 6 megapixel ultra wide, which shoots at f2.2. Both can record in 4K, and let's just agree that the quality is alright. The cameras on your phone are probably better, and personally, I don't really care about the rear-facing cameras on any of my tablets. I really just use them for scanning documents. I'm not sure why anyone would use these cameras to film or take photos. You really don't want to be holding up this massive tablet in public. You're not that guy. The LiDAR scanner is a different story. I do see the value for that in certain applications and professions, and I think it has massive potential for the future. All right, let's talk about specs. Really quick, because I don't like spending a lot of time on specs. You can read the box yourself, but I know some of you are interested, and for the sake of being complete in this video, let's just quickly go over them. The iPad Pro has the M1 chip. This is the 1TB storage version, which comes with 16 gigs of RAM. It has an 8-core CPU, an 8-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine. The Samsung Tab S8 Ultra has a Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor. The 8-core CPU is paired with an Adreno 730 GPU. This is the 265 gig storage version, which comes with 12 gigabytes of RAM. These tablets are hard to come by right now, so unfortunately, I couldn't snag one of the 16 gig versions that comes with 512 gigs of storage, which is something to keep in mind when we do look at the benchmarks. All right, let's run those Geekbench tests for you geeks, and these are quite interesting, I have to say. As you can see, the M1 iPad Pro smashes it out of the park in the CPU test. Both the single core and the multi-core performance are much better. The GPU test, same story. iPad absolutely obliterates the Samsung. Having said that, I don't get overly excited about benchmarks. It's the real-world performance that really counts. One thing I do care about though is read and write speeds on the internal SSDs. I'm a creator and I do work with large files, so it actually matters to me. And again, the M1 iPad Pro steamrolls the Samsung in terms of both read and write speeds. Again, maybe not super important to a lot of users, but if you're creative or you work with massive files, this is definitely something to consider. Right, moving on to the more interesting stuff, and that is the display. Let's start off by saying that both of these devices have phenomenal displays, okay? We already know that the M1 iPad Pro has that ultra bright, ultra crisp, liquid Retina XDR display, but we also know that Samsung is known for creating killer displays, and this one is no exception. And dare I even say, the best display I have ever seen on an Android tablet. Still, there are differences, so let's talk about those for a minute. The Samsung has a 14.6-inch Super AMOLED display with HDR10 and a pixel density of 240 ppi, whereas the iPad has a 12.9-inch Liquid Retina XDR Mini LED display and a pixel density of 265 ppi, which is a little bit higher than the Samsung, but I doubt it makes a big difference in real life. Now, there's a lot of debate about what's better, AMOLED or Mini LED. I don't think it's that easy. I mean, AMOLED has much better contrast, better blacks, and it's generally a bit snappier. But on the flip side, it's not as bright, and Mini LED will give you fantastic HDR. And speaking of brightness, that is probably one of the biggest drawbacks of this tablet because it is only 500 nits peak brightness, which is about the same as the iPad mini, and that's not very bright. So that might be an issue when you're using this tablet outside. Just for the sake of comparison, the M1 iPad Pro has a typical brightness of 1000 nits, which is twice as much, and it can go as high as 1600 nits in HDR mode. And of course, that is a pretty huge difference. The display is 120 Hz, as you can see, which is very nice, and it looks absolutely stunning and very snappy on this Super AMOLED display. You can bring it down to 60 to save some battery, I guess. And that is again one of the advantages of the M1 iPad Pro, which has that Pro Motion display, which means it can adapt the refresh rate according to the way you're currently using your tablet. So when you're just reading some text, it will be super low and it will jump all the way up to 120 Hz for those visually demanding tasks. There is an option on the Samsung where you can use Bixby routines to set the refresh rate on certain apps, but that's a rather tedious workaround and it still only lets you choose between either 120 or 60 Hz. Anyway, both displays are superb, and at this level of quality, all of this just seems like nitpicking. I do actually prefer the Samsung display for two things: media consumption and multitasking. As awkward as the dimensions on the Samsung might feel in portrait mode, they are perfect for viewing content in landscape mode. Unlike the iPad, where widescreen content will result in the big black bars, that same content on the Samsung will almost fill the entire screen, which looks absolutely amazing. The second advantage of the bigger and wider screen is multitasking. Now, my preference here might have something to do with the fact that I use an LG ultrawide as my main computer monitor, but multitasking on a wider screen is just really nice once you're used to it. And speaking of multitasking, I would definitely give the win to Samsung here. While multitasking on the iPad did come a long way and it works pretty well, the Samsung offers a lot more flexibility and more windows. You can have 3 separate multitasking windows open and still add a pop-up window on top. You can resize them however you want. It's just overall more flexible. The last thing I'll say about the screen is that both can be used as external monitors. The iPad has Sidecar and the Samsung has a similar feature called Second Screen, but unfortunately I can't test this for you because it only works on Windows. Right, let's quickly talk about the S Pen versus the Apple Pencil before we move on to using the tablets with their keyboard cases, because that is where the real differences become visible. So in my unboxing video, I told you guys that after switching to Apple, the one thing I miss the most about Android tablets is the S Pen. I love using my tablets to take handwritten notes, but I hate the way the Apple Pencil feels on the glass surface of the iPad, which means I have to use a Paperlike and usually also one of these pen tips to create some friction to improve my handwriting. These are amazing tools, by the way, links to both in the description. The tip on the S Pen is a lot softer, which makes writing on the glass so much easier. Another thing I like about the S Pen is that it comes with a tablet, whereas you have to pay extra for the Apple Pencil, which is a very Apple thing to do. On all other fronts, however, I do prefer the Apple Pencil. The weight distribution is just better, the pairing is snappier, you can use it between iPads instantly, and the charging position makes much more sense to me. I don't like where Samsung has us put the S Pen. It's in the way when I want to lay it down flat, it gets knocked off too easily. It's just not practical. I know you can attach it to the side as well, but it won't charge there. Having said that, charging is only needed to operate the button on the S Pen. You can actually still use it for writing and drawing when the battery is depleted. The latency on the S Pen has improved, but it only matches the snappiness of the Apple Pencil in some apps, like the native Notes app. In a lot of other apps, it still lags, and I wish it would just function at peak performance across all apps. Now, I'm not much of an artist, and I use my stylus for handwriting, so if you're an artist, the soft tip on the S Pen might not work for you at all. I guess it all comes down to personal preference. One thing to keep in mind though, if you are an artist and you're thinking about switching from Apple to Android because you like what you see here, is the lack of apps on Android devices. You will not find apps like Procreate, Affinity Photo, and many more of the creative apps you're used to in the Google Play Store. The same goes for popular handwriting apps like GoodNotes and Notability. The selection of apps in the Play Store is still limited in comparison to the App Store. Having said that, Samsung has actually been playing a part in improving this and getting more apps over to their device. In fact, they have been talking to LumaTouch, and LumaFusion, which is by far the best video editing app on the iPad today, is coming to the Samsung Galaxy Store this year. So yeah, if you're considering making the switch and checking out the Ultra, do keep in mind that some of the things you might have grown accustomed to will not be available. There's no iMessage, no FaceTime, no AirDrop, and while there are alternatives to all of these things, I've seen people regretting their decision switching from one platform to another based on some of the apps and the workflows they took for granted but didn't get on the other platform. A quick word on gaming. As you can imagine, games look absolutely stunning on both displays, and both tablets seem to handle heavy games without problems. But again, the offer is limited in the Play Store. I don't think either of these tablets are great for handheld gaming. Tablets like the iPad mini are much better suited for this. These two big boys are definitely on the heavy side, and it makes much more sense to hook up a controller and place these on your desk. On my iPad Pro, I've been using the PlayStation 5's DualSense controller, and that actually seems to be working just fine on the Samsung as well. By the way, the battery life on both of these tablets is pretty great. I get through a day of pretty intense usage on both devices without issues. Now let's talk about the one thing that probably sets these two tablets apart from one another the most, and that is using them in their respective keyboard cases. To me, the iPad Pro is not complete without the Apple Magic Keyboard. In fact, that Magic Keyboard is what got me excited about iPads again when it came out in 2020, and it hasn't disappointed. My iPad pretty much lives inside the keyboard case, and I use it like that most of the time. Same thing goes for this Samsung Tab S8 Ultra, which to me is only half a product without the keyboard case. Because unlike the M1 iPad Pro, the Samsung actually comes pretty darn close to being an actual laptop replacement. Why? Because as soon as you snap the tablet onto the keyboard case, it switches to DeX mode with its own dedicated UI, which lets you use this tablet as an actual desktop computer with floating, resizable windows and everything else. Is it as good as an actual PC or a Mac? No, but if you compare it to a Chromebook, I'd say you're pretty accurate. I used to think DeX was just a gimmick, but it came a long way and it's actually very, very usable right now. Full disclosure, when the Magic Keyboard was announced, I really hope to see something similar from Apple. Remember that commercial, your next computer is not a computer? Nothing happened. I had the same hopes again when the M1 iPad Pro and all of its processing power was announced. But both times I ended up disappointed. Now, if we look at the keyboard itself, the Magic Keyboard is a very clear winner for me for a number of reasons. The trackpad on the Samsung keyboard is not instant. It always takes a split second to reconnect after it's been idle for a little bit, and that can become quite annoying. I don't like the fact that the back comes off. I do actually like the backside itself with a protection for the S Pen and the little kickstand, but I think that should be sold separately. I don't like it in combination with the keyboard. The angles are very limited. You can't really use it as an actual laptop, meaning on your lap. You can't really prop it up in bed to watch videos. You will need a table or a desk to be able to set it down properly. And you can't really angle it at 90 degrees either, or it will just fall over. The Magic Keyboard, on the other hand, stands up perfectly. It's well balanced and it has all the angles I need. Another big advantage of the Magic Keyboard is that it offers pass-through charging, leaving the Thunderbolt port on the actual iPad free to use for other stuff. If you want to charge your Samsung while it's in the keyboard case, you will have to use its one and only port, and you will have that cable dangling off your tablet. And last but not least, the typing experience on the Magic Keyboard is absolutely superior. The Samsung keyboard feels flimsy and cheap, and that's pretty bad considering they're charging $350, which is the same price as the Magic Keyboard. Now, what's the conclusion here? I think both tablets are absolutely fantastic and they are the best on the market for both operating systems. I think which one is best for you depends on your needs, your preferences, and how deeply you are invested in the respective ecosystems. I will say this, I really believe that this is the first time in a very long time that the iPad Pro has an actual competitor. And I really hope Apple feels the heat and gets that extra kick in the pants to bring us some true innovation in their next versions of the iPad Pro. Or I can see a lot of people jumping ship and trying one of the ever-improving, shiny new Samsung Tabs. Guys, I know this was a long one, and if you made it to the end, I salute you. If the video was useful to you, please give it one of these. It really does help the channel. Subscribe for more content. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.